Thank you for joining us on Heritage Events Live. We're delighted to welcome you to the Best Defense Strategy for America, Elbridge Colby on the strategy of denial. Please welcome our host, Tom Spohr, Director of the Center for National Defense at the Heritage Foundation. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to our event, the Best Defense Strategy for America, Elbridge Colby on the strategy of denial. Well, for what purpose should the United States be prepared to fight? And how should U.S. forces be ready to fight such wars? These fundamental questions should form the center of any U.S. defense policy, but are often skipped over in favor of questions like how many F-35 should we buy, or how many ships should we have in the Navy's fleet? Yet, until you answer the more fundamental questions, answers to these specific questions will be elusive and of questionable value. The Biden administration is presumably hard at work writing the national security strategy and the next national defense strategy. Done correctly, these strategies will help focus the U.S. security apparatus on the most pressing threats facing the nation. The defense strategy in particular will specifically inform efforts to shape, equip, train, and posture the United States military. The 2018 National Defense Strategy was important as it signaled a sharp turn from the global war on terrorism to great power competition. And although it came out over 3 years ago, the U.S. military is still making that transition. Well, there's no shortage of voices and opinions about what should be included in America's next national defense strategy. But no voice is probably more worthy of consideration than Bridge Colby's. Bridge is the co-founder of the Marathon Initiative. He's a long-time think tank scholar, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, and most significantly, for the purposes of today's discussion, served as the Pentagon's lead official for the development of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. He is the author of a new book released this Tuesday titled The Strategy of Denial, America's Defense in an Age of Great Power Competition. Here's the book right here. We'll be placing information on how you can get your copy of this book at a special publisher's discount in the chat feature of this webinar. So we'll start out with me asking Bridge a few questions, and then we're going to turn to you, the audience, for your questions. And there's a way for you to enter those questions on the webinar feature at the chat box. Just go there, submit your question, and we will take it here, and we'd be delighted to put those questions to Bridge. So Bridge, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be able to talk about this with you.
Yeah, thank you. So this book could not have been easy to write. It is, I mean, it's based on a ton of research. There's hundreds upon hundreds of footnotes to it. Interesting to me, you use what you called in your introduction a deductive approach. So you did not jump right to the conclusion and say, here's what Bridge thinks. You actually made the case, explored all the options, and then came to your conclusion. So what was your motivation in writing the book? Who was your audience for it?
Well, I think the motivation was basically the sort of mismatch that I think you put your finger on earlier in your remarks between the legacy strategy that we've been pursuing, which has been heavily forward in multiple theaters, very high political aspirations, and the reality of the geopolitical power balance, and in fact the military balance, especially with those great power rivals that you mentioned, especially China above all. So, I think we, as I try to lay out in the preface, we are in a serious mismatch. And, we've begun this transition. But in this period of transition, I think a strategy is really critical because a strategy is especially important when you can't sort of like smother problems with resources. And I think that's kind of where we were in the last 30 years. We couldn't do everything. We couldn't necessarily nation build in Afghanistan and Iraq. But most of the kind of really serious problems we might worry about, we could take care of with our overabundance of power and resources. And that's just not true. There are more threats and problems in the world than there are resources we have to deal with them. And so I think for me, and this was really driven home to me in the Pentagon. I mean, you had a distinguished military career, and one of your many assignments, I believe, was as the head of the Army's strategy and resources division. And the old phrase is that strategy wears a dollar sign, that it's easy to come up with pamphlets that express a lot of aspirations, but what strategy really is connecting dollars and cents and efforts and puts and takes with a coherent framework. And that's what I wanted to lay out here. And I think, so the audience is the defense establishment. I mean, uniformed military officers as well as civilians and the people who think about that kind of stuff, but also the broader public. Really important to me that, not to me, but I think it's really important that our military strategy, our defense strategy, has to be explicable and reasonable to the American people, because the great power rivals we are potentially thinking of fighting, that could go to a nuclear war, or even if it doesn't go to a nuclear war, it could be exceptionally costly. So people need to buy into it, and I was acutely conscious in the book of trying to explain that. So I don't know whether I was successful or not, but I think it's to a very wide audience in that respect, people who are interested in these issues, and I think almost all Americans should be interested in these issues.
Yeah, I love the way in the book you went through all the various options and narrowed it down to get to your conclusion. A lot of these kinds of books, people will just give you their conclusions up front, and you don't know why they closed other paths. So I love that part of it. So I'm going to jump to a part where I have some disagreements with you. I love to just run right into a conflict. And in your book, you say that in order to focus its scarce resources, the United States should not size, shape, or posture its military to deal simultaneously with any other scenario alongside a war with China over Taiwan. And that raises two questions for me. One, all federal resources, especially we speak about this at the Heritage Foundation, are constrained. So there's not a limitless supply of money. But in the past, the U.S. has spent 6% of its GDP on defense, and now we're spending 3.4%. So the decision to spend more or less is ultimately, as you know, a political one. So do we have to assume that we're always going to have scarce resources, that we can only choose one scenario?
So this is a great point. I think the spirit with which I wrote the book, and I hope it seems like hopefully you've taken it, and I hope others, is that I try to lay out a framework. I call it a kind of a simplifying logic, and that people can see. And I don't claim to be omniscient or necessarily the expert on all the actual decisions coming out of that. Even such sensitive issues I talk about as whether Taiwan is worth defending. I think people can reasonably have different views, even though I think we should. Similarly with the simultaneity issue, based on the factors that I've laid out in the framework, I think you could make arguments in different direction. As Bob Work puts it, these are differences among strategists, I think is a good way of putting it. They're reasonable, and because you're dealing with uncertainty and risk and so forth. So in the book, what I said, the argument is, look, there are three primary functions that we need to focus on in light of the fact that our military capability and resources as they exist, or as we could reasonably expand them, are not sufficient to deal with all the threats. And those are to deny China regional hegemony, and to do that, we need to deny them the ability to subordinate an ally or Taiwan in the Western Pacific. So that's the conventional forces scenario. It's to sustain a nuclear deterrent that can actually deter multiple adversaries concurrently, and that now very much includes not only Russia, but also China. And then also a lower cost way of doing the counterterrorism mission. Those are the three core missions. There might be a few other things here and there, but those are the basics. And actually, what my view is, if the American people think that we should spend more on defense for the reasons that you lay out, then I think the next scenario to spend on would be Russia, helping European NATO defend itself against Russia. The reasons I'm not persuaded at this point is, first, I think the threat from Russia to Europe is much less than China to Asia. Russia will not be able to dominate all of Europe. It might be able to break apart NATO, which would be a very grave peril or disaster really for us, but it would not be the same league as China taking over a hegemonic position in Asia. Moreover, the Europeans are more than capable of mounting a conventional defense, more or less on their own, with some American assistance. They outweigh Russia in GDP and latent military power. So and I think they should, hopefully we continue pushing them on that front. And then finally, I think we do need to moderate our amount of defense spending. I mean, the paradox of military spending, I think, is you want to keep it low so that first for the reasons that private citizens should decide where to put their money, but also because if you spend too much on defense, it can have a negative impact on the economy. But on the other hand, if you spend too little, you may end up spending too much later. I mean, if we'd spent more in forward deployed forces before World War II, it would have cost us less in the long run. So I think that's a debate. My own view is, and certainly given the level of resources that are currently talked about being allocated, I mean, the Biden administration effectively called for a cut in the defense budget. We have to be laser focused on that one scenario and not get caught up in thinking about other scenarios at the same time.
Okay, good. Let me pull that thread just a little bit, because there is a common argument that you will find in defense strategies. It's almost I don't know how to describe it. It's a shortcut. and that is you'll say, hey, we intend to do less in this particular region, and we are going to count on our allies to do more. And so it would not surprise me to hear that type of thinking in the Europe area. But what we're finding is most of the European nations in NATO are not spending the 2% of GDP on defense, despite what would be historic prodding during the Trump administration. Every tool in the toolbox, public humiliation, you name it, was attempted. You read about the Germans, and they can't agree to even arm their drones. That's just too politically difficult for them right now. So is it feasible in that context? And you talk about latent military power. Is it feasible to assume that you think that Europe can or will do more?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, first off, I think let's narrow the problem a little bit. I mean, the Europeans, many of them are spending more, and some of them are reaching, for instance, the Poles, who are a frontline state, are spending well over 2%, and I applaud them for it. A number of the Scandinavian countries, including ones not in NATO, like Finland and Sweden, are spending more. The Brits, despite being in the pandemic, have increased defense spending. The French spend a good amount, and others. So if we narrow the problem, the heart of this problem is Germany, which is frankly delinquent on its responsibilities, which is not only damaging, but I think morally wrong. And I've said this to them directly. So that's one point, and there has been progress within NATO. The second thing is, look, ultimately, if this continues, and particularly from the Germans, this will become a game of chicken, which is to say, if we are faced with the choice as the American people, with a decision of, are we going to prejudice or decrement from our ability to serve our primary geopolitical interest, which is preventing China from dominating the world's largest market area, because the Europeans are being themselves delinquent about defense spending. If they're going to force that choice upon us, we have to make the right choices, which is focusing on Asia first. And if you think back to World War II, we had a Europe first strategy. We're going to make the best decision for our enlightened interests and so forth. And I think that and the Europeans will bear the costs and the risks, which is too bad, but they will ultimately be the ones to do that. This is why I think it's really critical that we not over reassure our allies. I mean, look, I think we can be constructive and sort of polite, but also be firm and tough. That's sort of a difficult balance, and I actually think how to do this burden sharing thing well is one of the great things that we need to think about more going forward. But if we over reassure our allies and tell them every commitment is sacred and will always be there, we're not doing them or ourselves any service. We need to be candid. And things do move. I mean, Japan, for instance, has been, it's almost been a sacred, item of the Japanese political system that they wouldn't spend more than 1% on defense. Now, in the race to succeed Prime Minister Suga, the LDP candidates are talking about even doubling it. So we can make progress. The question is whether we can make progress quickly enough.
Excellent. Yeah. So I'm going to dive right kind of into some of the core issues in this book. And in the book, you advise that the U.S. should focus on China's best military strategy versus maybe the most destructive or maybe the most likely. And there's a lot of writings in this town that you will hear people say China doesn't want war. China will never go to war. They prefer to achieve their means through much less kinetic. And so the United States should focus its efforts on gray zone warfare. That's a huge cottage industry in this town. But you don't agree with that in this book. And why should the U.S. focus on China's best military strategy? And what do you think that best military strategy is for them?
Great. Well, I mean, I would say fundamentally, to put the case positively, the reason is because the best military strategy is the one that's most gainful for them. So the most destructive military strategy, for instance, they could launch a nuclear attack on them, but that would be insane because we would do the same to them. So it doesn't really make sense. And that's a real issue because if we spend all our money on national and missile defenses, we'll lose in the primary theater. So we got to get to the right level where we deter them, but we got to go after and similarly, the likelihood thing, there's almost an arrogance in that. There's a sort of a hubris, right? Because it presumes that the Chinese would never think they could beat the Americans, right? If they think they can beat us, why wouldn't they either precipitate a conflict or start one, or just threaten one and everybody know how to resolve? I mean, people who say that the Chinese wouldn't start a war, to me, or wouldn't risk a major war, remind me of the people who said before 2008 there could never be another depression. That it's actually the very statement and the thinking along those lines that makes it more likely, because that will lead us to be unprepared for a high-end military conflict. And the critical point here is that a high-end military conflict, the direct application of military force, It sounds old-fashioned, but there's no better way to coerce somebody than to hold a gun to their head. You know, all this gray zone stuff is like, by definition, is not that dangerous, right? I mean, take Taiwan. The people on Taiwan, they don't want to be part of the PRC. They don't want to be run by Xi Jinping and his you know, police apparatus, Red Guard, you know, descendants, you know, metaphorically. So China's not going to be able to con them into giving up. If China's really serious about it, which I think they are, then they're going to be thinking about the direct use of military force.
And that is China's best military strategy.
Yeah, I think China's best military strategy, so its best overall strategy, if it wants to become dominant in Asia,
yeah,
it's what I call the focused and sequential strategy, which is basically picking off parts of this coalition that's going to try to balance, you know, think not only the US, but Japan, India, South Korea, hopefully Australia, Taiwan. China's going to pick off those parts, the weaker and more vulnerable parts of that coalition, so that the rest of the coalition gets the idea that this coalition is just a hollow shell, and then it's going to collapse and China will be dominant. Because China doesn't, the truth in what you were saying earlier, alluding to, is China doesn't want to start a huge war a la World War II. No, it wants to do what Bismarck did in the 19th century in unification in Germany. Bismarck took Prussia from one state among many in Europe in the space of about 10 years to a war with Denmark, Austria, and France, radically changed the geopolitical map of Europe. In some ways, we still live with it. And that's what China, I think, its best strategy would be. Its best military strategy in that context, if you're thinking, all right, how do we take down these vulnerable parts of that coalition, is the fait accompli, which is, they don't want to start a huge war. They want a small focused war where they create a new set of facts on the ground, and then we and the rest of our partners and allies basically decide that we're going to live with it. You know, a grander version of what the Russians did in Crimea. And the problem is, it's a really good strategy, and it's very possible that we and others might decide to live with it.
Yeah. So there's more to fear than just a Facebook post, it sounds like. And,
that's right.
Yeah. So in your book, you talk a lot about allies, and I really like that discussion, you know, because it was a lot more granular than we normally get about. Normally, the argument for allies are, you know, somebody pulls out a Winston Churchill quote, which are very handy. You know, I forget what he said about allies, you know, but you know, exactly. But anyhow, but so many people say, hey, the more allies you have, the better. End of discussion. But you, however, advise a more nuanced approach, talking about, especially in the Western Pacific, about how some alliances could carry along with them entanglements, potential costs. So could you kind of give us a little bit more of your thinking on how you think about alliances, especially in that neck of the woods?
Sure. No, thanks. And I share your view. I mean, I look at alliances the way I look at everything in this perspective. I think people like you and I look at my job as kind of trying to work for the American people. I mean, I don't collect a federal paycheck, but I mean, this should make sense. You know, the strategy here should make sense for the American people in an enlightened way that can, you know, kind of be positive some with others, but basically in their interest. And that's why, you know, there's a tendency, especially in the Beltway, to talk about alliances as if they're like marriages or some kind of religious pact or whatever. And that, to me, they're more like business, maybe a little bit more, but like more like a long-term business partnership. It should make sense for both sides. Sometimes it may need to be equitable, sometimes not, but it should always be in our interest. And people kind of hand wave about how our allies are so great. And our allies have gotten a great deal, many of them, for a long time. And we were willing to go along with that because we had other things that we were interested in. But it's not going to work anymore. The only way we're going to be able to balance China and address the other challenges and threats in the world is if we all lean in the way that we're best suited for doing. And I think the issue of allies is critical in the Pacific in particular because, as you said, the paradox is that, you know, we need an anti-hegemonic coalition that's strong enough to stand up to China. But if we bring in too many countries, we risk getting entangled in a war that's not going to go well. And I mean, many people watching, I had family involved in Vietnam. I mean, it was a tragedy for us. And in the end of the day, I think, you know, it's fair to say that it was not worth the cost. You know, I mean, with all due respect for those who served there. If we'd been able to draw that defense perimeter maybe in a different way, maybe we would have spared that and still won the Cold War. And that's, so in a sense, Vietnam kind of hovers over my thinking in this book, because we need to be tough and we need to be assertive and help others protect themselves, but not go too far where and that's both a kind of a moral commitment to the American people's interests, but it's also strategic, because after Vietnam, we almost pulled out of Europe entirely. You know, the whole thing could have fallen apart. So I think that's really critical. And what I basically say is our defense perimeter, which is to say the states who we're really committed to, Basically, it should trace along the first island chain. Basically, and with all due respect to a distinguished Army retired general officer, I think our strong suit is aerospace maritime warfare, and that's that's our wheelhouse. And if countries like Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Australia, maybe in the future the Indonesias of the world, where China has to use maritime forces and air forces to get there and project and sustain military power, there I think we can do a good job, especially when we work with them. The Japanese have quite a good Navy and Air Force as well. So that's sort of how I think, but that's going to be dependent. That's going to be dependent on how much other countries are willing to do. I mean, if Japan's not willing to step up, we may need more others to carry us along, which is going to be more dangerous. We may have to work with Vietnam. But then what happens if China threatens Vietnam? So the idea then, to kind of put a finer point on it, is if we can develop a military strategy that can allow us to defend those countries forward, we won't have to do crazier things later that are going to be more costly and risky.
I got you. Excellent. So one of the central themes in your book, and you talk about it to the point where you must have even gotten tired of writing it, is about the anti-hegemonic coalition. And you suggest that it is perhaps the key to defeating a Chinese attack. Can you talk about the dynamics and how we manage such an anti-hegemonic coalition?
It's basically the idea that China's too strong for us to balance alone, or anybody individually in Asia. I mean, China's about half of the total power of Asia if you use kind of conventional metrics like economic size and that kind of thing. So standing alone, let's say Japan stands up to China, China will beat them around, right? And we're too far, and so our interests are attenuated in our ability to project power. So we need countries to work together. The question is, what does that look like? I actually don't have a fixed view of what exactly this is going to look like. To be clear, I don't think we necessarily need an Asian NATO. In fact, an Asian NATO may be counterproductive because it may involve too much commitment. So this is something looser that I'm talking about, this anti-hegemonic coalition. So a country like India, actually, our relationship right now is probably pretty good, that we're able to do more and more and more. But actually, India pulls a lot of its own weight. It's not interested in just being a tributary of the United States. Okay, great. In fact, my view is we should kind of like outsource South Asia to the Indians and sort of empower them. And that's kind of, but there are going to be other places where we're going to have more formal relationships, and particularly alliances. I think of alliances which are like formal commitments as kind of the steel in the spine of that coalition. That's like Japan, effectively Taiwan, in my view, South Korea, Philippines, Australia. That's front line, because if the Chinese are going to get out, they're going to push out through those maritime approaches. And if we can hold them there, speaking of Churchill, one of my favorite quotes is he said during, I think, World War I or just before, I think, he said, if we win the decisive battle in the primary theater, we can set everything else right again after. If we can hold China at the first island chain or thereabouts, we can deal with Africa, South America, South Asia. We'll get around to it because we'll be in an advantageous position. But if we lose in the first island chain, we'll just fall farther back and be weaker, and then we're going to be imperiled everywhere else too.
Excellent. Yeah, so I would remind our audience to submit your questions. We are taking questions, and we'll get to those in just a moment here. And I would also, I'm going to plug the book again, Strategy of Denial. Information on how to get your copy is in a handout on the webinar tab. This anti-hegemonic coalition, how would they think about taking that apart like a can opener?
Yeah, exactly. It's I think of it sort of like short-circuiting is kind of what the focused and sequential strategy is. Basically, you don't want to catalyze the whole coalition to fight you. So the mistake the Germans and the Japanese made actually in World War II was to basically get everyone to fight them. That's not what you want to do. You want to have a series of short, sharp wars which convince everybody else that this coalition is full of it, basically not going to work for you. And particularly because if China, say, goes after Taiwan and then maybe goes after the Philippines, people are going to get the message. So I think credibility is important in a particular way. I don't think it's going to be, I think we can deal with the ramifications of the catastrophically handled withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think we can deal with it because people can tell the difference between Afghanistan's fate and, say, Taiwan. If you're in Japan, though, Taiwan is a neighbor. I think it's within eyesight. I think you can see the senkakus from Taiwan and vice versa. So, this is a much different thing. And if the Americans basically say, well, we can't do well enough to help Taiwan because the Chinese are just too strong. Well, how does that apply to Japan and Philippines? So that's what China wants, is to kind of like, instead of fighting everybody, basically take down a few of these guys, and then the message goes around, look, sometime you're going to be put under that hot microscope, and it's going to go poorly for you. The Americans are going to talk a good game, but they're going to let you go. And so it's better to cut a deal. That's the thing, is it's better to cut a deal with the Chinese. And that's a very real possibility. Lee Kuan Yew had a very cutting remark about the ties, fairly or not, but he said they bend before the wind blows. But it's an expression that applies to almost, pretty much every country, which is they'll see where the wind is going. And if they think they're going to be left out to dry, they'll cut a deal.
Excellent. Yeah. So as the United States puts its strategies together to deter that kind of attack, deterrence theory, of which I am not a scholar, kind of divides itself into these two thoughts about deterrence by punishment, applying as more punishment than an adversary can withstand to get them to deter, and then deterrence by denial, denying an objective, the objectives of the enemy. And your book, especially with its title, The Strategy of Denial, seems to come down fairly strongly in favor of a strategy of denial. Can you talk about that?
Right. Denial is better if you can get away with it, or you can make it work, because denial basically takes the weapon out of the other side's hands, or essentially negates its power, right? And then the deterrent effect is because, well, you may have a bow and arrow, but I've got a perfect shield, then you're never going to get through, so you're never going to really think it's worth doing. And of course, these aren't mutually exclusive. And in fact, in the book, I do weave punishment in at the highest levels for reasons that I'll get into. But denial is much better, and it's particularly important when you don't have an advantage in resolve. So the problem that we face is that we're fighting 10,000 miles over there, but Taiwan, China thinks is part of its own country. South Korea is 100 miles from the Chinese coast. Philippines, 100 miles from Taiwan. Vietnam is a neighbor, et cetera. I mean, in a vacuum, Chinese probably are going to care more than we are. I mean, who knows? And that's something I talk about. That's actually, we can actually manipulate that, and we should, so that we do end up caring more. But the word manipulate's not right. We should actually plan in a way that makes it more in our favor. But given how far we're talking about, and most Americans have never been to Taiwan, probably don't know anybody from Taiwan, a strategy of denial is better because it asks less of us in terms of our suffering and our sacrifices, hopefully. Because denial is about, taking that sword out of the other guy's hands. Punishment strategies, usually they don't work as well because people, often will resist giving up something they really care about, even under pressure. But also because if you inflict punishment on somebody, that's one thing if the other guy doesn't have the ability to inflict punishment back on you. But China does in a big way. Sure, they could impose sanctions, they could turn off TikTok, but they can also launch conventional missile strikes on the homeland, and they could launch nuclear strikes on the homeland. And in fact, as we've learned from Admiral Richard and General Hyten, they're dramatically expanding their nuclear forces and probably accelerating it maybe accelerating it from what we can tell. So if we start punishing them, well, what are they going to do? They're going to punish us back. How does that end? I think, unlikely to be in our favor. So I think the best strategy is we use denial to block the invasion if we can. So because China's best strategy is going to invade Taiwan and take it over and create new reality, and then rinse and repeat for the Philippines until the coalition falls apart. So if we can block them from seizing and holding the key territory of one of our allies, we deny the fait accompli. Then China has a decision. It can say, well, I'll give up, live to fight another day, lick my wounds, what have you, or I can try to escalate this. They've lost in the immediate battle. And they can do that. They could blow up some tankers in the Middle East, but that's probably not going to matter for us that much. We might be able to stop them. Or they could say, launch nuclear strikes in America. But then we're really going to be angry. And we can impose costs back on them. But in that context, they will be the ones who are bearing what I think of as the burden of escalation. They're going to seem like the aggressor and the bad guy. And we're going to be, FDR talked about the our righteous might, or Clausewitz talked about the flashing sword of anger, of vengeance, I should say. And that's not going to end well for them either. And so that kind of mixture is, I think, but emphasizing denial is the right strategy for us and the right strategy for the American people. And for what fundamentally our interests in Asia are really, really important, but they're not existential truly. And so we can't have a strategy that relies on existential risks, without thinking about how we would get there.
We're going to go to the audience questions next. I want to hit you with one more because I want to make sure we talk about it, and that is your thoughts on a binding strategy within this anti-hegemonic coalition.
No, thank you. This is, I think, one of the hopefully more novel aspects in the book. So the binding strategy is basically the idea, okay, what do we do if we can't make a kind of focused denial work? So the ideal here is if we could say sink the Chinese fleet, shoot down the air armada, and kill or capture the forces or eject the forces that land on Taiwan before they can seize and hold, and do it in a way that's relatively limited, so that China's bearing the burden of escalation. Okay, that's the ideal, and we should focus up. That's why I'm so laser focused on it, because it's a high standard. What if we can't do that? One could be because we are neglecting, because our allies don't step up enough, like the Taiwans and the Japanese. Could also be because the Chinese are just going to be too strong. I mean, that's a reality, even if we make a good effort. So in that case, what happens if they're so strong that we either have to wage a much larger war in order to defend, say, Taiwan or the Philippines, or we may even have to recapture them, a la World War II in the Pacific, which would be the worst outcome. But in that case, the big question is going to be, are we going to have the willpower to do it? And that's not obvious because of the points I was just saying about our interests being important but not existential. So in that sense, what I was alluding to earlier, we have to figure out a way where our resolve will be catalyzed, where we will see it as worth our effort and risk to do it. And also that our allies and others will see that. And so basically what we should be doing is we should, our strategy should deliberately be postured in a way, our forces and our way of operating should be postured in a way that if China wants to apply this best military strategy, this focused and sequential strategy using the Pentagon fleet, they will actually have to basically tick off everybody else and make us all angrier so that we will be willing to do the things that we need to do to beat them. The concrete example I use of this, in December 1941, say December 6, 1941, I don't know the polling data, but I think the vast majority of Americans were completely uninterested in engaging in a war with Japan. And not only were they not interested in a war with Japan, they definitely weren't interested in a war with Japan like what happened. 2 months later, after Pearl Harbor, Hong Kong, Bataan, Corregidor, Malaya, Singapore, the American people were, FDR's point about their righteous might. We were angry, we were engaged. So we actually want to put the Chinese in a position where in order to even try to salami slice, they will have to start a larger war. And that means spreading our force out, working with more allies and partners. This is where this Australian move is positive. We're more with the Japanese, these kinds of things. Our posture is less brittle, less of a glass jaw. They're going to have to hit us harder. And I think if the Chinese see that even though they just want maybe to try to salami slice against Taiwan, but they can't keep the war small, then they'll be deterred. I actually think, and I think you served at this time, but as obviously as a junior officer, but in the later part of the Cold War, I think this is what it was really about. I think even and hopefully we can do better than this, but well into the later part of the Cold War, we still thought we would lose a conventional war in Europe, given the size and sophistication of the Soviet bloc forces. But I think our force was strong and resilient and capable and credible enough that if the Soviets had invaded, they knew they were going to start a war and that we were all going to be willing to go the distance, and that would ultimately go up to the nuclear level. And in the end, it was enough, and I think that's what we should aspire towards at a minimum.
Almost reminds me of the NATO battalions, strike groups we have in the Baltics right now in Poland, if you look at their size, they're almost meaningless, 1,000 people apiece, but every NATO nation has a contribution there.
But you got it. The one thing is, it's got to be more. I think the problem I have with those is that they're kind of a tripwire. I think you've got, because they, in a sense, the Russians could probably just ignore them.
Right.
I think it's got to be enough and resilient and capable, and more like Reforger and the forces along the Indo-German border. These are forces they're going to really have to fight through. They're going to have to deep strike. They're going to have to blow up a lot of things. That's because then it's more like, they can't just ignore them like a symbol. Because the problem with the tripwire is it presumes the thing which is at issue, which is our resolve. Yeah. And we need to activate our resolve. The other example I like to use, by the way, historically, is Lincoln. I think the Army actually did suggest that they withdraw the troops from Fort Sumter.
Yes.
But Lincoln, I think, adroitly understood that, sort of intelligently understood that keeping them there, and then ultimately the South fired first, 75,000 volunteers for the Federal Army.
All right, we're going to go to audience questions, and Mr. Dakota Wood is going to ask us what we've got.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom, Bridge. I actually think the quote was, the only thing worse than going to war with allies is going to war without them. So anyhow, So we have literally so many come in. I'm going to have to group some things. I'd like to call out names, and I just can't do that. But on Taiwan, what are the odds of China actually doing this, and what time frame? So that was one of the very first questions that came. It's more of a numbers thing. But rolling into the larger Taiwan, another one seems it says the questioner sees it seems to be a near holy obsession or a religious thing, on the part of Beijing to take Taiwan. So with that kind of commitment, keep in mind time frames and those sorts of things, can the West outlast that business? And then another questioner said, isn't China just bluffing? They have colleagues in Taiwan they talk to, and the Taiwanese saying all this is just a bunch of bluster. So kind of grouping that together, likelihood, time frame, is it a bluff? Can we outlast this objective?
Well, I think I can actually answer them all in a way together, which is I think the Chinese do really, really want to unify with Taiwan, and they're prepared to do so forcibly. But whether they actually do so is going to depend upon the costs and risks of doing so. So obviously there's a big benefit, but what are the costs and the risks? If the Chinese know they're going to fail, I mean, Mao Zedong was obsessed about unifying with Taiwan, but he knew he didn't have a hope of getting past the 7th Fleet. So he never tried, and he avoided an issue after the 1950s over it. And same with Deng Xiaoping, who I think certainly his calculus was the same. So it's the calculus that's critical, and that's what we need to affect. The problem is that the Chinese have been laser focused on this for 25 years, and they got a lot of money to put on it. And what I like to say is China is a long-term problem in the way that heart disease is a long-term problem. If you don't take care of it in the near term, you'll never get the long-term. So it's both a near-term lethal problem and a long-term problem. And the issue is that their military modernization program is already coming into the force, like already and right now in this decade. Meantime, we've been slow to move. I mean, Tom mentioned kindly the 2018 National Defense Strategy. I think the third offset was the kind of precursor that started the focus. NDS built on that, but it's going frankly too slowly for my taste. Not for my taste, for the situation. And I think the FY22 budget request is also, it seemed too long-term focused. The long-term is a problem, but so is the short-term. And so this combination of factors makes me think that the Chinese leadership may do something before 2027, which is what Admiral Davidson, the former commander of Indo-PACOM, said. Maybe not tomorrow or next year, but sometime in the 2020s, they're going to say, well, we're looking good. Who knows what the future holds, economically and so forth for China. The Americans are finally getting their acts together, but their forces aren't going to be ready really until 2030 or after. Ditto for Taiwan and Japan, which have lagged but are behind. If you look at why the Germans went to war in 1914, and you look at why the Germans went to war in 1939, the Japanese too, it was often for this kind of window of opportunity perception. So I think this is why it's really critical that we be focused very much on the near term as well as the long term, and try to patch together a sufficient deterrent that speaks to that calculus, that says you're going to fail. Because the good thing that we have going is, A, it's an island. If people don't want to live under the Chinese, they have to get over basically 100 miles across water, which is tough to sustain an operation. The Germans couldn't get across 26 miles, I think is the English Channel. And the second is, if the Chinese fail after they've tried to invade, that is catastrophic. So, they may string up the CCP leadership on the one hand, but also the region's going to say these guys are really dangerous because they're willing to use force, but they're resistible. And that's kind of the worst outcome for a country like China, is if people think you're bad and dangerous, but also you're safely resisted, then so that means their probability level has probably got to be pretty high. So we shouldn't take solace from that, but we can do this, I think.
The jump, we got a lot coming in here. So I'm going to try to group together 4, and hopefully the grouping makes sense. One, in the South China Sea, wasn't it the case that China had a fait accompli during the Obama administration with the island building and all that? Kind of related to that is almost this lawfare sort of thing. So in international arbitration disputes and whatnot, the Philippines actually won a case against China about intrusions, and yet China didn't care. They went off and did what they wanted to do anyway, right? Which would kind of imply that they can do these things to achieve their objectives in this gray zone kind of business without really going all on military. Related to that then is, are you focusing too narrowly on China in this military approach. And if it's not a power projection thing like we've done in the past, then there are implications to the U.S. military. So are we going to shift from active duty, large standing to more of a guard reserve sort of thing, right? So is it really about war? Are you too focused militarily speaking on China? And aren't there implications to that? And then linked to it is Robert Gates famously said, we've never gotten our forecasting or our predictions right, ever. And so are we going down, I mean, this is what the questioners are looking at, going down a path where making too many promises and you might have strategic consequences?
No, there's a lot there. Let me try to, maybe I'll go in reverse order. I mean, with all due respect to Secretary Gates, I had the honor of being in a fellowship named after him for a number of years, a big admirer of his, but I think he's wrong about that. I mean, we have been right in our forecasts. And the thing is, forecasts are contextual and they're dependent. It's like the market. We were right about the Soviets being a threat. We prepared for it and never came to be. So we weren't wrong in our forecast. We were accurately, or accuracy is not the right term. We were putting down insurance against a potential future, which did not come to pass, whether because, we'll never be able to tell definitively. But I certainly think we weren't over preparing in the Cold War as a general principle. I mean, and the other thing is the Soviets spent a lot of money on the military, right? Likewise, am I overemphasizing? I think the question is kind of, am I overemphasizing the military over the gray zone? Well, the gray zone works very well. For instance, like the Chinese basically took these disputed features. I mean, these are literally like things that come above the water a tiny bit. And then they put huge dredgers in there and created new islands. So, I mean, it's almost like, it's not, they didn't seize anybody's territory. I mean, in the kind of intuitive sense, like they didn't take something where it was a populated area as part of an established country. They're really operating on the almost beyond the edge of what is a country. And it's difficult to project power for a country like the Philippines into the waters of the South China Sea. So look, the gray zone can matter in these kind of marginal or sort of ungoverned spaces, basically. But the Chinese aren't going to be able to sort of like gray zone their way into seizing the island of Luzon and coercing the Philippine government into acceding to their will. The reason that I focus so much on the military is not because I think that the military is or sort of war and peace are the most valuable part of human affairs. I mean, to the contrary. I mean, as I end, what we want here is a decent peace. But if you don't get, it's a little bit like the police. If you have a neighborhood that doesn't have law and order and it has crime, forget about commercial development, forget about schools, forget about people are going to leave the neighborhood because they're not going to want to be there. So first you got to take care of the police. Then once you get to that position, you don't really think about the police that much. It's kind of on autopilot, right? I mean, if you lived in New York in the late 1980s, early 1990s, you were only thinking about crime. Under Giuliani and Bloomberg and stuff, the crime was down. It wasn't a big deal. Who thought about the police, right? Similarly, if you don't get the military balance right and your deterrence right, China's going to have an incentive. And this is particularly because of, actually paradoxically, because the gray zone doesn't work and because economic sanctions don't work. Look at the Australians right now. The Chinese are blasting them with economic sanctions, and the Australians are basically saying, stuff it, right? Which is, g'day, and kudos to our mates down under. But that's good, but it's also paradoxically increases the allure of the military instrument for China. And so that's why we got to be, and it gets back to that, what's the relative, if we can get it so the Chinese don't see an advantage in using military force like the Soviets never did in Europe, then we can shift the competition. One thing I worry about with this administration is they have this tendency to say or imply that this is going to be a political, economic, technological competition with China. It's like, well, the gateway to that is making sure the military balance is adequate, and I'm not convinced they're paying enough attention there. As my colleague and good friend Matt Pottinger puts it, we're going to have a sprint to get in the marathon. That's the kind of the way we think about it. And then I think the last point on the future force structure, I try to make a virtue of my ignorance about the specifics of reserve, active, guard, these kinds of things, which are very important, by concentrating in the way that I think, Tom, you were suggesting at the framework level, and not, I don't pretend to have all the answers by any stretch. But I think here, over-focusing, we're better off over-focusing because actually we're not over-focusing, A. And B, look, you can see China is by far the most powerful country in the world. I mean, okay, what if Venezuela gets really frisky or Cuba gets really frisky A, there's not much they can do, and B, we always have forces that we can use in the active force or call up from the Guard and the Reserve to handle these, because they're not going to develop a death ray or something, right? So we got to make realistic assessments and investments based on where the danger is most acute, and it's very clearly most acute from China and Asia.
So we're going to have time for one more, but it can't be like a coalition of 10 questions.
That's right.
But let me just say this. I really appreciate in your book that the last or second to last chapter was not, here's Bridge Colby's recipe for deterring China. That it's, we need stealthy drones flown off aircraft carriers, and we need, more acoustically superior submarines. I love that you kind of pulled back from that and just showed us the framework. But Dakota, for your...
Yeah, the last grouping then has something to do with these coalition things, right?
Okay.
Whether it's anti-hegemonic, whether it's a binding strategy, if you're picking key allies, are you in the group or out of the group? And it really comes back to this, are you assuring allies or over-assuring, making too many promises? And related to that, we've had the Quad. We now have this new trilateral agreement between the UK, the US, and Australia with the nuclear submarines. So if you could kind of go back to this approach to picking and choosing allies, and if somebody is not in the club, does that present, a problem? Or if you're in the club, you must be really, really important, and so are you over-promising and over-committing? And that would probably spend the rest of our time.
No, it's a great question. It's one I really thought it was one of the harder aspects to think about, was this this differentiation between this anti-hegemonic coalition, which is kind of vague and a little bit shifting. Like, I think Vietnam's basically part of the anti-hegemonic coalition, but I don't know if they agree, But it's sort of like, are they behaving in a way where China effectively has to reckon them as standing up to them? And in one way or another, working with others to do so. Meanwhile, there's alliances, which is like, we put our credibility on the ground, on the line to defend this country. Obviously, Japan, South Korea, but in effect, I would say Taiwan is like 2/3 or 3/4 of that. So I call it a quasi-ally, basically. Look, I think, again, the point is always to think back, are we achieving the goal, which is balancing China? And that's basically, are we strong enough together that if they did want to go for, at the end of the day, to a big war, we would be able to win together? That's the ultimate criterion, because war and violence are the ultimate forms of coercion, right? I mean, I don't need to tell this to you two gentlemen, but I mean, if you really want to persuade somebody, as Mao himself said, power comes from the barrel of a gun. If they know that if they escalate to the max level, that it's not going to work well for them, they will be checked. They won't necessarily be contained, or they won't do what we want, but they will have to respect at least a decent number, a sort of degree of our interests. This is going to be the statecraft. I think that's going to be really where the puts and takes and the creativity and the intelligence are going to need to be going forward. And again, I don't promise to have the answers of what that looks like, but I think the question about over-reassuring is very on point. I think we have gotten into a mode where we over-reassure our allies, and I think, Tom, you talked about, like, we kind of talk about our allies in this sort of romantic sense almost. But we really need to think about that they have a purpose for us, which is to deny China hegemony or any state like Russia hegemony over one of the key regions. That's also their interest. It's not falling in love. It's more like a business partnership, but that's a sounder basis for an agreement. I mean, one of the things I sometimes maybe rudely kind of say in these international discussions I'm part of is people talk about shared values. And look, I love our country immensely, but I mean, for instance, I grew up in Japan. Japan has shared values in some ways and not in others. Has kind of different political culture, obviously different culture in a lot of ways. They're our most important ally in the world because nobody is stronger and more acutely threatened by China. Okay, like, that's a rationale. We know they need to spend more. We're in it together, whether we like it or not. So I think that's how we should think about it. And then we should mix assurance and pressure. Our allies should know that if they don't step up, A, we'll be angry, sure, but that's not enough. B, there is always a possibility that we just won't be able to do it. I mean, I was very encouraged by Taiwan's announcement the other day that they're going to spend a lot more on defense. I mean, they are in real risk of being abandoned. I mean, I'm defending Taiwan, but there are a lot of people I really respect who quietly or not are saying it's not worth it. And it's not a dumb argument. To me, it's like a 70-30. So Taiwan's fate in a lot of ways in its own hands. And so I think that what they did the other day is really important, and they should continue in that direction. The other thing is, I mean, we can defend countries in different ways. I mean, during the Cold War, we were going to defend West Germany. Yeah, because we liked West Germany, but also because West Germany was the strongest economy in Europe. We weren't going to let the Soviets take it over. And our plans depended on what the West Germans did. If the West Germans sat around and did nothing, we were going to drop a lot of tactical nuclear weapons on West Germany. We told them that. And they didn't want that. They wanted a forward defense at the border with using, not dropping tactical nuclear weapons all over the Federal Republic. And not coincidentally, they developed a very robust Bundeswehr. In fact, the Germans, to our earlier conversation, they had 12 active divisions when they were a country 2/3 their current size. They can do better. It's their duty to do better, and they should do better, and we should pressure them to do better. So again, one of the things I'm disturbed right now is our relations probably are too good with Germany. There should be a lot of tension in our relationship because we care about Europe. So this is the kind of way that it's not, we need to not vacillate between overly tough and kind of personalizing things on the one hand, but then reassuring and saying that everything's going to be hunky-dory. I mean, I think in a sense, the Biden administration is tripped up by its own approach on this. I think the Australia deal is a triumph and they deserve applause for it. But then the French are livid. But the French should be, I mean, I probably should have done better diplomacy, obviously, but also how surprising is this? Obviously, the Asia is the priority, and this kind of thing is going to happen. This is just the beginning. But we're only going to get all together in ways that are going to be suited for our different alliance and partnership relationships if we're candid and realistic. And just to put a kind of close, I mean, that's what I'm trying to do with this book, is provide a framework for doing so. How exactly our relationship with France or Germany or Vietnam should evolve, I don't know. I have some thoughts, but they're very fallible. But I hopefully have provided a framework that will allow people to have a more focused discussion about how to do that.
Well, this has been wonderful, and unfortunately, we are out of time. I will say we have only scratched the surface of what's in Bridge Colby's book, and so please do not listen to this podcast or YouTube video and say, I've got the book, because you do not. You just have the thinnest layer of it. And I want to thank the audience for joining us here today. If you work on the Hill or another think tank or just have questions, please contact us using the information on the screen there. And you're going to get a survey at the end of this, and I hope you fill that out. But in the meanwhile, Bridge Colby, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tom.
This was wonderful.
Thank you.
And audience members, thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again at another Heritage event. Goodbye.